So looking at these approach plates, there's all sorts of crazy information that you may understand the gist of the instrument approach plate, but there's a lot of other stuff on the sides here and buried in this plate that may be a little bit confusing to you. We're going to go ahead and take a deep dive into a series of approach plates here and explain every single little bit and part and piece of this plate, all these numbers you see around here in the plan view and the profile view, all of that stuff, and of course the parts and pieces of the plate, what they're called, everything you need to know for your instrument check ride, as well as being a CFII, as well as just being out there in the real world, flying on IFR flight plans. Everything you need to know, all explained right here. Let's get to it. Hey guys, what's up? I'm John from Fly8MikeAlpha.com, and I'm going to be your instructor today, taking you through the ILS Runway 15 instrument approach procedure going into Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport up in Alaska. Now, this is part of a 10-part series exploring 10 different instrument approach plates that we go through on our IFR course on Fly8MikeAlpha.com. For more information on that, check out the link in the description below. Very helpful course on there to help you prepare for your flight training, for your written exam, for your check ride, all that good stuff. But let's go ahead and dive into this and get started here. So we'll start on the outsides of the approach plate. This is the margin information. So we have the top margin up here. Obviously, this is the city, Anchorage, Alaska. This little number up here, AL 1500 FAA, that simply means the FAA is responsible for this. This is a FAA plate, not a military plate. So the FAA is who controls this approach procedure. It's going into the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, ANC, and of course the four-letter identifier for that, the ICAO identifier, is PANC. It's the ILS Runway 15. Notice it's not a localizer ILS, so there is no option here. You do not see any sort of localizer minima published for this approach. This is purely just an ILS approach, kind of unique. And then we have this little number up here, this code that you're like, I wonder what that's about. Well, that's saying that in 2020, on the 366th day of the year, and you're like, wait, 366th day? Yeah, so actually, 2020 had 366 days, so on December 31st of 2020, this is the Julian calendar they're using here, that's the last time they made a change to this plate. If you want to make sure you have the most up-to-date version of a plate, go ahead and compare this on the FAA website to what's on your iPad, and if your number is the same, then you're in good shape. If it's a lower number, say yours said 19-something or 2322, then yours is probably not as up-to-date as what you should have. Now, this area here departs from the margin, and this is going to be called our briefing strip. So we'll go ahead and finish up with the margin here first. This is telling us this is in the Alaska booklet for the instrument approach procedures, and this is the valid dates from the 2nd of December 21 to the 27th of January 2022. Down here in our bottom margin, that's what they call the bottom part here, again, just telling us ILS Runway 15, not a localizer, giving us the coordinates for this, and then also telling us the amendment number, and it was last amended the 10th of October 2019. And you're like, hey, wait a second, you just told me that it was changed on December 31st, 2020. That's correct. So up there, December 21st, 2020, or December 31st, rather. Now, down here, what we're getting at is the last time the approach procedure was amended. So something like the minima, the visibility, the ceiling, that sort of stuff, that was amended. And it's the 7th amendment to this approach procedure. What did they change on December 31st? Could have been something as simple as just changing the ground control frequency or something like that. Now let's go ahead and jump into our briefing strip. So we get the localizer DME, and we have the identifier for that, which is the IBSC. So that's the actual identifier for the localizer facility, just like a VOR has identifier, 3 letters right there, TED for that VOR, TED. Now, the frequency underlined, 111.75 for that localizer, and we have a channel number, channel 54, Yankee. That means there is DME on that localizer. Obviously, it is a localizer DME indicated to us right there. The channel 54 doesn't really matter too much to us. That's all taken care of for us by our nav radio. When we dial in 111.75, it's going to tune up the DME on channel 54, and there's 2 different frequencies that it could select, or how it kind of pairs to that, either X or Y. Again, nothing that we can control in the cockpit, so we don't have to sweat that too much there. The approach course, final approach course inbound 149, that is magnetic. All right, so really important that is magnetic. I like to ask people when they're going for an instrument check ride, hey, is this true or magnetic? And it is, in fact, magnetic. Makes the most sense, right? Because we're already going to have our DG tuned up to a magnetic indication. The runway landing distance available is going to be 10,000 feet. The touchdown zone elevation, 151 feet. MSL, and the airport elevation, 151 MSL. DME is required here. It doesn't say DME or radar required on this plate. DME is required. All right, so just because we have a radar fix here, yawn, all right, that's radar, and ATC could identify that for us on radar, does not matter. We still have to have DME required on the airplane. DME installed there. Now, what is DME? Do we have to have the crazy old school radio distance measuring equipment? No. You can simply get away with something like a Garmin 650 or a Garmin 430, Avidyne, any of those sorts of approved GPS units in your airplane will count as DME. If you're curious if your GPS that's mounted in your airplane counts or not, I can tell you if it's portable and you can remove it from the aircraft, then probs not. But if you're curious about yours that is mounted to that panel, then you can check the TSO, the paperwork on that exact unit, the TSO, how it was approved by the FAA, and if it's going to qualify or not. The next thing we see here, we have that little upside down T. So that means that there is some sort of non-standard takeoff minima, or there's a departure procedure or a graphic departure procedure that might apply. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, in the takeoff minimums, obstacle departure procedures, and diverse vector area or radar vectors part of the instrument approach procedures, we can see we have that little upside down T triangle there, so we know we're in the right section. Don't get confused here. Anchorage, Alaska doesn't mean we're in the right spot. That's actually for Merrill Field, MRI, a different airport altogether. We want to come down there and find Ted Stevens Anchorage International, also located in Anchorage. And we can see correct airport, PANC, sounds good to me. What are the takeoff minimums? Well, remember standard takeoff minimums for a 2-engine airplane or less, simply 1 mile. Takeoff minimums don't actually apply to us in Part 91, so we don't have to adhere to these, but clearly they're saying, hey, you need to have at least a 300-foot ceiling and 1.5 miles, or standard with a minimum climb grading of 205 feet per nautical mile to 400 feet, so slightly greater than the 200 foot per nautical mile. Basically, there's just some slight obstacle there that they want you to have a little bit increased margin of error. Again, not applicable to us in Part 91. Am I going to change what I'm doing here in Part 91? No, because personal minimums say I'm not going to take off with anything less than a 500-foot ceiling and at least 1.5 mile visibility anyways. So I have that basically beat anyways, if I adhere to my own personal minimums. Now coming down here, we can see we have departure procedures. We have a textual departure procedure for runway 15 there. Runway is 7 left, 7 right, and 15. It's going to be a climbing right turn heading 252, magnetic, thence, ... Come on down here to find the next set of ... to connect them. And so it's thence on the TED VOR DME radial 210 and ENA or Kenai. So basically the Anchorage Ted Stevens VOR and the Kenai VOR DME radial 028 to the Kenai VOR DME before proceeding on course. So they're saying, hey, take off runway 15, hang a right turn heading 252, and then proceed direct the Kenai VOR DME on that radial 028. Get right to it, and then you can go ahead and proceed on course from there. That's the textual departure procedure, which might be a good idea to go ahead and comply with that if you're in your little underpowered Cessna 172. There is no graphic departure procedure for this particular airport here, especially for that runway. And as far as the other takeoff obstacle notes, there's a little bit in here you could look at for runway 15, what they're concerned with, little tree, stuff like that. Nothing too crazy as far as how tall that stuff is, but about 90, 100-foot tall trees and stuff around the airport. Luckily, 10,000 feet of runway shouldn't be too much of an issue for us. So getting back to the approach plate. The next thing we see here on this instrument approach plate is in-op table does not apply. What does that mean to us? Well, it means that the in-op table that we find in the front section of those instrument approach procedures basically doesn't apply here. So if the approach lighting system is broken or some component of that is broken, it doesn't apply. We do not have to increase the visibility. We can see that we already have 4,000 feet of RVR, 4,000 foot visibility required. So more than your basic half mile that you'll typically get on an ILS anyways. We can see the type of approach lights we have here, Malsif A4. So that's going to be our approach lighting system. Kind of looks a little bit like this. And then on the next part of our briefing strip here, we have the mixed approach instruction. So climb to 800 feet, then climbing right turn to 3,000 on heading 200 and the TED VOR DME radial 210 to Jukip. And that's going to be on the 15 DME mark from TED and hold there. TACAN aircraft climbed 800 feet and blah, blah, blah. Well, you're not a TACAN aircraft. That's going to be a military thing. We don't have TACAN receivers in our airplanes, so we're just going to stick to this first part up here for us. And we can see what that really is, hey, yep, you hang the right turn, radial 210 off of Ted, and 15 miles right there. We can see 15 from Ted is the Jukip intersection, and we'll make a direct entry into that holding pattern. We can see that is the missed approach. We can see we have a missed approach alternate fix. So basically still Jukip, still the exact same thing, except this time we're identifying it off of the Kenai VOR, so ENA VOR frequency 117.6 rather than TED 113.15, and it's going to be 34.2 miles from Kenai on that radial 028 coming off of Kenai compared to the 210 radial coming off the TED VOR. So same exact missed approach, really, just a different way to identify it in case perhaps the TED VOR is out of service. This TACAN missed approach fix not going to apply to us because we're not a TACAN airplane, just like we said we weren't. Moving on to the rest of the briefing strip, digital ATIS. So it's that kind of computerized voice rather than the human voice. Pros and cons there. Well, humans make mistakes, but humans can also make sure that the computer's not making mistakes. So more prone to computer mistakes here, less prone to human mistakes when you have a digital ATIS. Just kind of that boring, slow voice. Doesn't really move quite as quickly as those air traffic controllers like to talk. Anchorage approach control frequency 118.6 is the next one. That 290 is a military frequency, doesn't matter to us. The tower frequency always going to be bolded, so really easy to find right there in the middle of the briefing strip, 18.3. Again, military frequency, don't care. And then we have our ground control frequency in the military version of that, don't care. Clearance delivery frequency, kind of nice to get that when you're on the ground there. 19.4, military, don't care about that. We've gone over these right here, but next thing I want to talk about is the procedure is not authorized, NA. Difference between NA and N/A. So N/A not applicable, NA not authorized. Procedures not authorized for arrivals at the BGQ VORTAC on Victor 438-456 northbound and T227 northeastbound Tango route. So what's a Tango route? Just a quick review. That's going to be those GPS routes. And why is this? Well, let's take a quick look here. So there's the Big Lake VOR. We can see we have a nice bolded feeder route that sends us down towards the Card intersection, the initial approach fix at 3,000 feet. If we're coming in from the east, from the north, heading southbound, they're saying, hey, if you're northbound or northeastbound, getting towards the Big Lake VOR, then this procedure is not authorized. Basically, it's too hard of a turn for you to make and come back around and stay in a nice, tight, protected area. ATC shouldn't really do that to us. The only time this really applies is when you're cleared direct to the Big Lake VOR and you are in fact northbound on one of these routes, northeastbound on one of these routes. Well, if you're cleared direct to Big Lake VOR and you lose radio comms, you're not authorized to just go ahead and proceed inbound and just hang that tight turn right there heading back in. So it'd be great if we were cleared to some other fix or some other route to actually go ahead and begin this procedure, something like the initial approach fix Ivan. But just take a quick look here. We can kind of see there's the TED VOR. There is our Big Lake VOR right there. And here is our Tango 227. They don't want us to come from here or northbound on 456, 438, and then swing back around and try to join that procedure. So that's what they're trying to stop us from doing. If you were coming in on 456 from over here, no worries. That's a great idea to head direct the Big Lake VOR on 456 and then go ahead and begin the procedure on that 3,000-foot feeder route from there. Moving over here a little bit to the right, we have the initial approach fix of the Big Lake VOR. We can see 112.5 underlined, meaning there is no voice on that frequency. We have the Morse code identifier for it, the BGQ. We could punch that into a GPS and get there. And we can see channel 72 on the bottom of this, meaning yes, along with that symbol right there, indicating that the Big Lake VOR does have DME on it. Again, most of our airplanes don't really have DME in the sense of picking up DME from a VOR or VORTAC, like they did kind of in the old days. Now we typically just rely on GPS for our distance measuring equipment. Gets rid of all that slant range error and all that sort of stuff. Coming down here a little bit, this whole section here is going to be our plan view, and then this is our profile view. We can actually see the profile that we're going to fly the approach. This is the plan view. That's the airport sketch right down there in the bottom right. And then we talked about the margin areas already, and we've already been through our briefing strip. So We can see the terrain mapped out here. The brown stuff is the tall stuff. We got some restricted airspace. We have these radials that kind of indicate to us our fixes here for the DME arc that we could fly if we wanted to go ahead and fly a DME arc. We have our initial approach fix there of Elam. It's on the TED VOR, 22 miles from the TED VOR on radial 037. We can also see here we have another fix for PEPV that ATC might give you something like direct PEPV and then cleared for the approach. Maybe you're coming in from the northeast there. And then we can see we've got 3,300 as our minimum altitude if we are flying the DME arc around this area. Between Ilium and PEPV, we can see that it's actually 6,400 because we have this terrain in this area, and then we can step down after PEPV down to 3,300. The LR330 and LR319 versus just the simple R means a lead radial, or basically a lead in. So it's as you're coming around here or as you're coming from Ivan this direction, approximately 2 nautical miles or so before the final approach course, they're going to give you this lead radial that you could tune in and identify if you're doing this the old school way off the VOR, and go ahead and give you an indication that, hey, you probably want to go ahead and start turning now. Luckily nowadays in all our fancy glass cockpits, typically the Garmin 430 or 650 or whatever it is you're using is just going to go ahead and tell you, hey, in 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go ahead and turn left or turn right to heading such and such. Makes life super easy for us. Keep in mind that unless you have a raging tailwind coming from PEPV on over here, that a standard rate turn in your little Cessna 172 going 75, 80 knots is probably going to be a little aggressive if you start turning at that lead radial. So it's probably going to get you somewhere right here, not all the way over onto the localizer. So consider a half standard rate turn, especially if you have something like a really strong headwind coming out of the west and you're turning coming from PEPV onto the approach this direction. You're definitely going to want to be aware of your ground speed, aware of your rate of turn and your radius of turn here to actually go ahead and get linked up with this localizer. If you are doing this the old school way and you've tuned in the TED VOR to actually go ahead and fly this DME arc, well, be very cognizant that you at some point switch over from the TED VOR. Pretty much once you're getting to those lead radials, switch that thing over to the localizer IBSC on frequency 111.75. Again, underline there is no voice. There's a channel number showing us, yes, we have DME on that localizer. And we can identify things like yawn on that localizer. Notice that's IBSC and then 21.8 telling us, hey, that's the DME coming from IBSC, not the DME coming from TED. If you're going to use TED and you're over yawn, it's probably going to be something more like 23 miles or a little bit more. But whatever it is, it's not 21.8. So make sure if you're trying to identify these fixes, something like card, you can see, hey, if you're going to use card, then it's going to be 13.2 miles on the IBSC localizer, if that's what you're using for DME. And if you're still tuned into the Big Lake VOR up here, BGQ, it's 12.3. And also, it says radar there, it says radar here. These are radar fixes that ATC can identify for you. However, they still want us to have DME on our own to go ahead and fly this approach. As we're coming down here, 8.6, these are just going to be basically the intermediate lengths of the segments. So the distance from Yan to Card, 8.6 miles, 3,000 feet is our minimum altitude that applies there. From Card on over to Cansey, 1,600 feet minimum altitude, again, 149 magnetic heading in there, and 7.1 miles from Card on over to Cansey. And then from Cansey to the actual localizer antenna itself, if you want to fly right into that thing and smack it, it'd be 6.2 miles to do so. The runway is going to be a little bit closer to that. We can see that here in the profile view, that the runway threshold is only 4.1 nautical miles from Cansey, but it is 6.2 nautical miles, or really 6.2 on your DME from IBSC if you're tuned into that using that as DME. Now, IBSC is DME. It's distance measuring equipment. It does have some slant error. Luckily, approaches are pretty shallow, so we don't have a huge slant range error there. But if you're using GPS, don't be surprised when you're 0.1 miles or 0.05 miles off of that. Again, radar fix for Cansey, radar fix for Card, indicated by the fact it says radar right there. Coming down here, let's see what else we've got that we should talk about before we move on too far here. We do have that MSA kind of in an unusual location here in the bottom left. Just that's where they could fit it. There's not much going on down there on the tip of the Kenai Peninsula down in this area. We can see we have a lot of different MSAs. If you are down over towards the Kenai Peninsula area, down towards this southwestern corner, 1,800 feet, not a whole lot to hit. If you're on the southeastern or eastern side of the airport, lots of stuff to hit. Your MSA becomes 8,700 feet, and to the north there, 5,600, within 25 nautical miles based off of the TED VOR. That is what they're basing it off of, not the center of the airport, basing it off the VOR. You can see that the VOR is pretty darn close to the center of the airport though. The rest of this plan view here just has a few little obstacles like the antennas here, 557 MSL. Those are going to be MSL heights. Another antenna. Looks like they built it up on a hill here a little bit, 1,827. And then there's some other peaks or high points of those mountains they've mapped out for us. Coming on down here to the bottom of the plate, we have the profile view. We have CARD. CARD is a intermediate fix, an IF. Obviously, we have initial approach fixes, Jan, Ivan out there, and LM out there. So that's the initial approach segment, which ends at the intermediate fix. Then from the intermediate fix to the final approach fix, which in this case is Kansi, but obviously it's the lightning bolt. It's wherever you intercept the glide slope is technically the final approach fix, roughly going to be at Kansi. There is no Maltese cross here because there is no localizer or non-precision minima published for this plate. So that's going to be our intermediate segment, and then we have our final approach segment beyond the final approach fix, or where you intercept the glide slope at. We can see our minimum altitudes there, so just above 3,000, above 1,600, doesn't have any lines on top of the 1,600 saying we have to be below anything. We have our glide slope is 3.2 degrees, and our threshold crossing height is 60 feet. Notice that the visual glide slope indicator and the ILS glide path are not coincident, meaning if you're on glide slope on your instruments and you pop out of the clouds, you may not see the PAPIs that we have right here on the right-hand side of the runway, indicating that you are dead on glide path. The VGSI angle 3.2 has a threshold crossing height of 85 feet. That's because the pilot's typically going to sit a little bit higher than the glide slope antenna. So the glide slope antenna is going to cross the threshold of the runway at 60 feet. Doesn't mean the landing gear will. Maybe the landing gear stick down below the glide slope antenna by quite a bit in the landing attitude. And then the cockpit, think something like a 747, sitting up quite a bit higher than that glide slope antenna. Threshold crossing height 85 feet for the actual visual glide slope indicator, the PAPI lights in this case. We have Kansi 6.2 from the localizer we talked about, and only 4.1 nautical miles from the actual runway threshold. Then we have our missed approach instructions kind of broken down here like we already went over up here, but 800 feet straight ahead, and then hang a right turn on a heading of 200 to 3,000 feet, take the TED radial 210 over to Jukip intersection 15 miles from TED, 15 DME from TED over there to Jukip. We've got our category A, B, C, and D minima, the straight-in ILS minima that are published, 351 MSL, 4,000 feet RVR, that's approximately 200 feet AGL, and about 3/4 miles Viz is what it's calling for there. And then lastly here, we've got an airport elevation of 151, a touchdown zone elevation of 151. We've got the black D. What does the black D mean to us? It means that there are declared distances published for this runway. The overall runway length is 10,865 feet. We can see that the landing distance available, LDA, is 10,000 feet, so slightly less. Hopefully you can get your 172 down and stopped in either 10,865 or 10,000 feet. Hopefully that 865 feet doesn't hurt you too bad there. We can see this little note here, 149 degrees, 4.1 nautical miles from Kansi. What they're talking about is the actual runway threshold. That's your final approach course, 149, with the runway threshold, 4.1 nautical miles from Kansi. We can see we have A4 type lights for the approach lights. This is what they look like if you're on vinyl going into runway 15. We have PAPIs. We have the PAPI negative, right? So it's not black. It's actually just a white circle there with the P, meaning it is on all the time, running up the electric bill. So is this one, so is this one, and so are all the approach lighting systems. They are not pilot controlled, or they are not going to be turned on manually in some way. They are on all the time. We've got those three little dots moving across here on the threshold of runway 33. That's indicating a displaced threshold to us. We've got the VOR over there. We've got a rotating beacon, 243 feet MSL. We've got slight downhill, 0.5% down slope for runway 15. The tower is at 277 feet MSL. Watch out for that. Other than that, I think we've covered, I guess we'll talk about the real runway end identifier lights for runway 33. That's what they look like. The touchdown zone and centerline lights on runway 7 left and 7 right. We can see that because we have those negative white dots. They call them negative dots on the chart user's guide. So that's an indication of centerline lighting. We also have centerline lighting on runway 15, but apparently not touchdown zone lighting. And then there's high intensity runway lighting on all runways. So that's really nice and bright. That's about it for the ILS Runway 15 into Ted Stevens Anchorage International. Any questions on this, you guys know what to do. Click on the Ask a Question tab at the top of the page on flightmikealpha.com. Be sure to check out all the awesome instrument courses on Flight Mike Alpha. So we have everything from your written prep boot camp, your checkride prep boot camp, your full-on instrument pilot ground school, as well as the instrument pilot survival course. So if you're out there flying IFR and you just want to stay fresh on things and make sure you're constantly learning, you always have more to learn, especially as an instrument pilot out there. Check out those courses online at Flight Mike Alpha. Any questions on this or anything I missed, definitely let us know in the comments below. That's what that's for. And until next time, if you cannot fly every day, then fly 8mikealpha.com. We'll see you guys in the next chart study video.